All right, greetings. This is the second section of section 7. This is 12.7b or whatever. This is where we are going to be given an equation and we have to find the center and radius of the circle. Remember that the general equation for a circle at center HK and radius R. HKR. Fill in the blanks, right? How do we do this? Well, we have to do this thing called completing the square. Take a look at our original equation right here. And notice what happens in part A. Part A, they set up. So we take our x terms and leave a spot to add stuff. Take our y terms, leave a spot to add stuff. Remember, in an equation, whatever you do to one side, you have to do to the other. So that means you're going to take whatever the sum of these two things that you add is going to have to add here as well. Now, let me clean this up a little bit. The way you determine how to complete the square is you take the x term and you cut it in half. That's what's going on right here. See how it's the 2 is in the denominator? That is, you're taking this term that's cut in half. Remember what the general form of an equation is. Quadratic equation. We want to look at what b halves is. Half of b and square it. That's the rule. That's what you have to remember. Half of b and square it. So what's half of -4? -2. I'm right here. Half of -4 is -2, and -2 squared is +4. Then you move to the y term. What's half of 2? Half of 2 is 1. 1 squared is 1. Well, if I add 4 and 1, that totals 5. So that means I have to add 5 to the right side. Well, what is this factored? Remember, reverse FOIL. Well, we already know it was b halves, 2. So x minus 2 quantity squared, this right here, x minus 2 quantity squared, is equal to that when you FOIL it out. Same thing over here. This was a 1. This has to be 1. Y plus 1 squared, well, struggling, is equal to y squared plus 2y plus 1. 4 plus 5 is 9. Now we have this equation, which we can use from up above in the green circles to determine what the center and radius of the circle is. We know that 2 is the h coordinate, 1 is the y coordinate, and the square root of 9 is the radius. So the center is 2, 1 with radius 3. When you graph that, 2, 1, apologies. 2, 1 with a radius of 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. Whoop. More or less. How can you test? You can do XY charts. Suppose you translate the circle by x plus 4, y minus 1. What's the equation? Well, we have to remember x plus 4. We're going to move it to the right 4 units, and then we're going to move it down 1 unit. So translate it to the right 4 units. 1, 2, 3, 4, down 1. over 3. All right, some examples of completing the square. Remember, ax squared plus bx plus c. We want to look at b halves and square it. That's this guy. What's that? 10. What's 10 squared? 100. Right? So take a look at this one to the right here. What would you do? Push pause and solve it. Beep. Well, half of negative 16 is negative 8. Squared is 64. So n squared minus 16n plus 64 is n minus 8 quantity squared. Leave me alone. I'm trying to teach people. So let's go down here. Same process. A squared plus b squared, ax squared plus bx plus c. Well, what's half of negative 1? Negative 1 half. Well, I need to square that. What's that equal? A negative times a negative is a positive. 1 times 1 is 1. 2 times 2 is 4. Done. Push pause. See if you can solve this one over here. Boop. Half of 7 is 7 halves, or 3.5. 3.5 times 3.5 is 12.25 for you decimal heads out there. Well, b halves is 7 halves, which is 3.5. So that breaks down like that. Let's move on. Solve each equation by completing the square. Well, notice here you have a full-on equation. You have to manipulate this a little bit differently. So I'm going to go through this. The first thing I want to do is I want to get rid of this number here. Bring this stuff down. And leave a square, because we're going to be completing the square. Well, what's half of 6? 3. 3 squared is 9. If I add 9 there, I have to add 9 there. Therefore, this breaks down to k plus 3 quantity squared. And this is equal to 62. Technically, you would continue. You would take the square root of both sides, and you would get k plus 3 is equal to plus or minus the root of 62, which you'd have to figure out what that is, but we're just going to leave it like that for now. So I'm going to push, you're going to push, man, I can't get that right. You're going to push pause and see if you can do this one on the right. Boop. Half of negative 18 is what? Negative 9. Negative 9 squared is 81. Up here, we subtracted 57 from both sides and got negative 51. When we add 81 to both sides, this factors into p minus 9 squared plus 30. I can tell you, I've mentioned this a lot, but the best way to get good at this stuff is to practice, practice, practice. One point that you have to take into consideration, the a in the ax squared plus bx plus c, the a always must be 1 for this to work. So when it's not, you have to account for that. How do I do that? Well, I'm gonna divide everything by 8. Hope none of you are afraid of fractions. Boom. that becomes, that becomes n squared. Boom, that becomes 2n. Both of those next numbers are divisible by 4, so that equals 5 halves. Both of the next numbers are divisible by 2, which means it's 5 fourths. Now you just follow the same recipe. I'm going to add 5 halves to both sides. Save room for my completing the square. What's negative 5 fourths plus 5 halves? Well, 5 halves is the same thing as 10 fourths, which is positive 5 fourths. Okay, well, follow the rule. What's half of 2? 1, and 1 squared is 1. So I'm going to add 1 there. I got to add 1 there, which says that this is n plus 1 squared. 2 and 1 fourth, which is 9 fourths. Now what happens? Well, to finish this out, you square root both sides. This is really nice because they're both perfect squares. Subtract 1 from both sides, and you get the answer. N is equal, what's positive 3 halves minus 1? That's positive 1 half. Negative 3 halves minus 1 is negative 5 halves. A lot going on. You need to know fractions. You need to know foiling, binomial construction, algebra. Channel your inner Miss Mead. Try this one over here. Hit pause and do it.